Tonight I'll be sharing 8 stories. I won't get into going through all of the different topics that will be covered. Instead, this time around I'll just keep it a mystery. However, if you are curious, you can always check the titles in the description. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share their stories. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Please remember to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I've been retired for just over 2 years now. Before that, I spent 24 years of my life as a detective for the Michigan State Police. It's a tough job, long hours, and little time spent at home, but it pays well enough for me to retire when I was 58, and it certainly keeps life interesting. It probably goes without saying that I've seen a lot of stuff that people don't normally see, nor would they want to. In all my years spent working for the MSP, I could honestly say I spent most of my time in and around Detroit. Though the case that sticks with me the most, 24 years later, happened about 250 miles from the Motor City. I'd only been working with the MSP for just over a year when I got a call telling me that I was needed in a small town up in Manistee County. It was the first time I'd ever been, and it also happened to be the last. This town, which I'm not going to name, though I'm sure some research will lead you right to it, was encompassed by woodland. I'm talking hundreds of square miles of nothing but woods. About 14 months before I got this call, a young woman had gone missing whilst out for an early morning jog in the woods. Fast forward 12 months and another girl goes missing. Same story, early morning jog, leaves no trace. Then 2 months later, another girl goes missing. You guessed it, exact same story. After the initial 2 disappearances, not a whole lot was ever uncovered. There were no convictions, no evidence, and only one arrest the second time around. An 84-year-old man whose cabin backed up against the woods a few miles from the area all 3 of the girls had decided to jog on the morning of their disappearance. The only real grounds for his arrest was the location of his home, and the fact that everyone in town considered him a bit of a recluse. He was questioned and released the same day. By this time, I was actually in Manistee County. Just over a week had passed since the 3rd girl had gone missing. The local detective who was there before me hadn't found a single item of evidence in those 8 days. His bright idea was that it was some sort of predator that had killed these girls. Possibly wolves or a bear. Now, at the time of the disappearances, wolves had only migrated back into Michigan about 5 years prior, so there was a slim chance of wolves being to blame, since there wasn't really an established wolf population in Manistee at the time. As for bears, it was a real possibility, but the signs of a bear attack were easy to spot. Considering all 3 girls had disappeared on the same trail, if a bear had been doing it, a body would have turned up from one of the girls by now. At the very least, there would have been some evidence of a struggle in one of the cases, yet there was nothing. Absolutely zero evidence to even give us the slightest idea as to what might have happened to these girls. It was as if all 3 had just vanished off the face of the earth. So, now it was my turn to make an ass out of myself and find nothing. The odds of finding anything obviously weren't in my favor, but I was young and dumb. I still thought I could solve any case that might get handed down the ladder of unsolved mysteries, so I started to talk to some of the locals and some of the missing girl's friends. I can't say her name, for obvious reasons, but the girl who had gone missing most recently was a 21-year-old college student, in the final year of her degree. I ended up talking to another one of her friends who was in the same class, and I didn't really find out much that helped the case, but, and this might be the strangest part of the story, I did find my future wife. Victoria had helped me throughout the 3 weeks I spent in Manistee on the case, and she ended up coming to visit me a month or so after I left. 2 years down the line, and we were happily married. Unfortunately, that's the only positive to take out of this case. Though I'd do it all over again if it meant finding Vic. Most of the locals had the same answer when I talked to them about the disappearances. It was the crazy guy who did it. They were referring to the old man I mentioned earlier, who had been arrested in relation to the case. I'd heard all kinds of stories from the locals about this man, that he was some sort of devil worshipper, that he tried to kill his family, and does the same to anyone else who comes near his cabin. Of course, it was all baloney. Vic actually somewhat knew the guy, and he was a far cry from how the locals portrayed him. A frail, old, 84-year-old man who could hardly murder a mouse, let alone 3 girls without leaving a trace, was what met me when I knocked at the rain-stained door of his cabin door. I'll never forget the words I was greeted with as the door creaked open to that decrepit cabin. "What the hell do you want?" Despite initial appearances, Frank, the man at the door, actually invited me inside when I explained who I was. He joked that he hoped I wasn't there to arrest him again, and I was glad to tell him I was just there to ask some questions. He even offered me a glass of scotch, which I politely had to turn down, since I was on the job. The inside of the cabin looked like, well, it looked like an old man had been living in it, on his own, for the past 2 decades or so. I started with some light questions about how he found living out here on his own, and what he thought of Manistee. I didn't wait too long before asking him what he thought happened to the girls. I didn't really expect him to say what he said next, even after hearing at least a dozen people refer to him as the crazy guy over the past 2 days. Every night, between a couple of minutes to about 30 minutes after midnight, I hear the same thing coming from those woods. It's an ungodly howl, like you ain't never heard before. Dead serious, he continued on. I seen it once, almost twice the height of me. Black as the night it hides behind. Some sort of wolf man. I just saw it the once back in 73, but I hear it almost every night. Now I was obviously unsure of how to react to the story. On one hand, I knew what I was hearing was completely absurd, yet the way Frank told me about it, the way there were genuine pain and fear behind his eyes, made me unsure whether to completely write him off as some insane old man. Then he offered me to come back just before midnight and hear for myself. So reluctantly, that's what I did. We waited for almost 30 minutes, and I was obviously beginning to doubt Frank's story, more so than I already was, when, sure enough, a howl echoes from the woods louder than any animal call I've ever heard. I can close my eyes now, and still hear that howl bellowing through the tree line, louder than a freight train passing by just a couple of meters away. It went on for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then it stopped, and never started again the rest of that night. In the 26 years of my life, I had never once heard a wolf howl in person, but even I knew that what I had heard wasn't any normal wolf's howl. Still, I wasn't prepared to write it off as what Frank called a wolfman, based on what my ears were hearing. The woods up in Manistee dwarfed the size of the actual towns in it, and there were a lot of things that might have been making that noise, other than some half-man, half-wolf. I spent the next week or so in a shitty old motel in the outskirts of town. Most of my time was spent reading files from the local PD on animal-related deaths. Most of them were from wolves killing children about 60 years prior. There were just 3 cases dated within the last 25 years. The first was a young man who had been mauled by a black bear a decade before. The next was some unfortunate case, which I can't quite remember. A young boy savaged by a dog or kicked in the head by a horse or the like. The last case, however, really caught my eye. It was marked down as Undetermined Large Predator. It didn't seem like a coincidence that the victim was a 22-year-old woman who had been murdered on a trail a couple of miles south from the current one in question. It had happened 24 years before the file found its way into my hands, which meant finding out much about it was doubtful. When I asked some of the older officers in the town about it, they informed me the family had relocated to Florida a couple of years after the incident, which meant finding them would be an unnecessary waste of time. What was different about this incident was that there was actually a body. Well, parts of a body. 2 fingers from the left hand, the entire right arm, and a small section of the right torso. The final line of the report stated, likely the result of a predator attack from a large black bear or wandering catamount. It occurred to me after reading the report that the girl's death had occurred around the same time Frank had claimed to have set eyes upon his ungodly wolfman. When I pressed Frank about his knowledge of the girl's death, he told me he remembered it well. When I said the report said it was likely a bear or cougar that took the girl's life, he laughed at the idea. They know damn well it wasn't no bear or panther murdered that girl. It was the same response I expected, yet it still made my level of intrigue into the case rise. It was definitely the most interesting case I'd ever been on to date. Quite possibly, even the most interesting case I've ever worked. It's probably why I spent so long working that case, and why I became so encapsulated by it all, even to this day. 9 days after I initially arrived in that dwindling old town in Manistee County, we finally had a breakthrough. A couple walking off trail about a mile from where the most recent disappearances had occurred had found a backpack. It was the girl's, and it was covered in blood. It was found under the shadow of an ominous old oak that stood alone from the rest of the dense thicket of trees. Other than that backpack and the things inside, along with the blood saturating it, there wasn't a single other item of evidence. Inside was a half-filled water bottle, a Walkman, and a towel. None of it was any use in finding the girl, though it did confirm that something had obviously happened to her, which came as no surprise. We had more search parties cover the area where the backpack was located. To my dismay, 4 days of searching brought back nothing. The DNA results confirmed that the blood on the backpack did indeed belong to the missing girl. Of course, it returned no evidence linking anything to a possible killer. Finding that small, crimson-stained backpack ultimately brought me no closer to figuring out what happened on that fateful November morning. In the days that followed the pack being found, hysteria swept over the small town in Manistee. People wanted answers, and made sure to stay well clear of the woods. They demanded arrests, and the local PD obliged by again arresting Frank on suspicion of the girl's murder. I made it well known to the officers arresting Frank that what they were doing, arresting someone based on the location of their home, was absurd. I made sure I was there for the questioning, and spoke to Frank alone before it commenced. It always sticks with me. The last words I said to Frank before the other officers came in to question him. There's no reason to worry. These idiots just needed to question someone to calm things down. I was right. They did need to question someone to calm things down. Though, I was wrong to tell Frank there was nothing to worry about. They told Frank he was being charged with the murder of the girl pending a court hearing. I could just stand there for a few seconds bewildered, until I realized what was really happening. I made sure the officers knew that I was the lead detective on the case, and that I wouldn't be letting the charge stand, let alone make it to court. That's when the local chief told me that I had been on the case for almost 3 weeks now, and found very little. That it was his town, and he had the jurisdiction to do what he was doing. I remember telling him, "You're a coward. That's an 84-year-old man in there." And getting, "That's a murderer in there, son," as the only response. Frank never made it to court. Around a fortnight after his arrest, he died in custody. A heart attack brought on by the shock of it all. I did everything I could to bring Frank's death to the attention of my superiors. I wanted to make sure the officers responsible for arresting Frank didn't walk away with no repercussions. It took some time, probably around a month after Frank's death happened, before I got some form of straight answers. I was informed that an autopsy was carried out on Frank after his death, that other than confirming he did indeed die from a massive heart attack, it also revealed a small tumor had been forming in the left side of his brain. This meant that Frank may well have been carrying out the murders as a result of the tumor changing his behavior, thus causing him to forget he had committed them, according to my superiors at least. Frank was never officially charged with any of the murders, though after his death, they did stop, which kept the locals satisfied. They had a face to paint on their killer, and the man behind that face was now dead. Frank didn't kill those girls, that I know for sure. There was no way a man of his age could carry out 3 murders in the space of 14 months, and leave a blood-stained backpack as the only item of evidence. His story about the great beast hiding behind the shadows never left my mind, nor did the howl I heard that night. Though, I couldn't go chasing shadows. This was my job. The case was at a standstill, and it wasn't going anywhere. If one of my superiors caught wind of me hunting a monster in the Manistee woods, I'd have been fired on the spot. After his arrest, Frank's son came by his house to get some things in order. I decided to volunteer as the one to grant him access to the cabin. I figured that maybe I'd find out more about the enigma that was Frank. As it turned out, his son knew less about his father than I did. Only that about 20 years ago, his father had been out hunting when he was convinced he had seen something ungodly, and it drove him insane. He spent the next 2 years of his life sweeping the Manistee woods in search of a monster that he would never find. It drove his wife away from him, and some 20 years ago, she took Frank's son and daughter with her, and left for Colorado. After that, he never saw his father again. It always bugged me. What drove Frank to become what he became? The only time I'd ever heard him mention his wife was when he caught me staring at a gray old photo of her sitting in the corner of his kitchen. "Elysa," he sighed, "my love." It was only a few words, but it was enough to tell me that she had taken a piece of Frank's soul with her when she headed for Boulder. I could never stop wondering what Frank must have seen to spark an obsession so strong he would sacrifice the love of his life. After I left that tormented town in Manistee, I never went back. Victoria returned to college in East Lansing and finished off her college degree. The third time she came to visit me, where I lived in Ann Arbor, she decided she was going to stay. We always talked about going back to Manistee. We never got around to making that trip. A few months after I left, Victoria's aunt, who she had been staying with, had died. So she had no reason to go back there. After everything that had happened with Frank, I had no reason to either. Vic passed away just under a year ago now. She'd been battling her cancer for a long time, and she'd already beaten it twice. She couldn't win the third fight. I might have been the cop, but it was Vic who was always the fighter. It never gets any easier. Losing the person who makes the sunrise have some form of meaning. I finally understand how after 25 years, Frank still looked at that picture of Elysa with more pain in his eyes than any mind could fathom. Since Victoria passed, I've found my mind wandering more and more back to Frank and my time spent in Manistee. I'd often wondered what it might look like now. I'd imagined it couldn't have gotten any worse. It crossed my mind every now and then, whilst I stared at some honeybee slowly draining the nectar from a sunflower. That I should go back there sometime. Then the mind would wander off to some distant valley, and I'd forget the idea ever resurfaced. That all changed a few days ago. After I retired, I left Michigan and made the not-so-long journey west to Wisconsin, where I've been living for the past 2 years. I still keep in touch with the guys I worked with through emails. Every now and then, a few of the guys will send me through some emails about some of the more interesting cases they're working, mainly in the hope that my experience will be of some help to them in decoding certain aspects of a case. James, a detective who joined the MSP a little over a decade after I had, was always in touch hoping I could be of some help. Old but gold, he'd often jokingly call my mind. In the last email James sent me, he wrote about a case he's been assigned recently. It was in a small rundown town in Manistee County. A girl had gone missing. She had been out for a run. It was in the early hours of the morning, on a woodland trail. No sign of her anywhere. I know, I have to go back. My wife and I are expecting our first child in a few months. Nothing can honestly prepare you for parenthood. You can read books, get advice from others, or ask God to make things easy for you, but nothing really works. It's a just try this kind of scenario, and it's frightening as hell. Doubly so if you've never been able to keep a plant alive. Sorry about that, bonsai tree. But you do your best. The one thing we had to do, outside of the 1,000 other things we had to do, in preparation for our son's arrival, was to set up the baby monitor. Our bedroom was across the house from the nursery, and even though our little bundle of joy would sleep in our room for the first 5 or so months, I wanted to hook up the camera in anticipation. I set up the camera over his empty crib and put the monitor on my side of the bed. The picture and sound on this little camera was surprisingly great. The night vision on it was solid. You can make out everything in the room, all of the decorations, his toys on the shelf, and his massive collection of stuffed animals amassed by his mother. The giant stuffed bear we kept propped in the corner was only slightly terrifying in night vision. The microphone was also really sensitive. When we first got it, I turned the volume all the way up, but then one night my Havance dog walked into the baby's room at night and barked at something, and it was so loud it bolted me up from a dead sleep. After that, 2 things happened every night. The baby's door stayed closed, and the volume went from 10 to 4 on the monitor. When my wife was about 6 months pregnant, we wanted to go visit her parents back east for a long weekend before she became too pregnant to fly. We were all set up to go when I suddenly came down with the worst flu of my life. I mean, it was coming out every end, and I kept flipping between burning up to freezing. Feeling bad for me, I got to miss the trip. To be fair, had I went, I think I would have gone Oregon Trail style, died in the cross-country trek. I can see the tombstone now. Here lies my balls. I did this all the time in the game, much to the chagrin of my teachers. It seems fitting it would be my final epitaph. After the Uber took my wife and our little dog to the airport, I was alone for the first time in 3 years. A bachelor all over again, only this time I wasn't drinking Natty Ice and swiping through Tinder, but was drinking NyQuil and swiping through Netflix. I finally settled on some run-of-the-mill horror movie and promptly fell asleep on the couch. Hours later, I was suddenly jolted from sleep. In my dream I heard someone call out my name, and my brain just hit the emergency brake and woke myself up. Half asleep, I looked around for someone else in the room, but I was still alone. Because I have a paranoid streak in me, I shuffled to each room to make sure I was the only person in the house. All the doors were still closed, and, satisfied that no other soul was in the house with me, I shut off the TV and lights, and trudged off to my room. Within minutes of hitting the mattress, I was back asleep. The rest of the night passed without incident. I felt better the next morning, groggy with medicine-aided sleep, but I was pushing through the cold. I made my way back to the couch, but before I sat down, I noticed that the door to my son's room was open. I didn't remember it being open last night. Granted, I had mainlined some NyQuil, but I know I closed it. I walked over and peeked inside. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Same setup as when I had last seen it. I just chalked it up to user error. I must not have closed it all the way last time, and went on with my day. Since I had felt better, I thought I should probably run to the store and do a quick grocery shop. We were running out of pretty much everything, and every meal was like a rejected challenge on Chopped. I left and didn't give anything a second thought. I came home hours later, and was greeted with a wide open door to my kids' room. I knew I closed it before I left. I went over and swung the door back and forth to check to see if it worked, but I think it was more for peace of mind, because even if it was broken, what the hell am I going to do? I was kind of like a guy who doesn't know anything about cars, and has to be the first dude to look under the hood and then shrug because it might as well be a 1,000-piece puzzle. Either way, that confused feeling was starting to dominate all my thoughts. I tried to forget about it and go on with my day, but as soon as the sun set, I felt that feeling creeping up my spine. Without thinking about it, I kept checking the door throughout the day. It stayed closed. I was making myself crazy for no reason. Instead of really leaning into that bachelor lifestyle and falling asleep on the couch again, I decided to watch TV in my bedroom, just as I was about to make my trip to the land of Nod, when I heard a crackle come from the baby monitor. Before I could put my glasses on to get a clearer look at the screen, I very clearly heard someone say my name. My blood froze. What the hell was that? I knew I actually heard it this time. It wasn't a dream. I took a deep breath and finally looked at the screen. There wasn't anyone, or anything, in the room, but I did notice something was off. The giant stuffed bear in the corner was missing. That's when I heard, faintly, a music box rendition of Ring-around-the-Rosie start playing from somewhere inside my son's room. I'd normally be fine with this, but there was one small problem with all of this. My son doesn't own a music box. I stood up and looked around my room for something I could use as a weapon. I don't know what lay beyond that door, but I did know I wasn't going to confront it with just my fists. I finally settled on a closet rod I had bought, but had yet to install in our room. Logically, I knew the damage I could inflict was minimal, unless I was going to be dealing with a monster made out of hangers. But it was peace of mind. I opened the door and walked out. I crossed my dark house as quietly as I could. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I noticed the door to my son's room was open again. Whatever was in there was now out here with me, or worse yet, wanted me to think they were out here. When I was just outside the hallway to my son's room, I could hear the music box playing. It was slowing down. Each note was a discordant metallic ping. I swallowed hard and reached over the hallway light switch. I counted to 3, and then darted my hand out and flipped the switch. The music stopped, but I heard the running of footsteps in the room. I pushed open the door and flipped on his lights. As the closet door slammed shut, someone was in the room. I could feel myself getting lightheaded. I never really assumed I would find anything, but now the only thing that separated me from whatever my horrible imagination could conjure up was a thin, wooden sliding door. I said a quick prayer, and then ripped open the slider. There was nothing there except a few hangers. I don't know why, but I bursted out laughing when I saw those small hangers. I was holding a closet rod, the perfect defense against my foe, baby hangers. I poked my head in the closet and didn't see anyone. I checked every corner of the room and didn't see anything. The windows were locked. Everything seemed to be in place except the giant stuffed bear was missing. It would have been easy to spot in the kid's bedroom. and it was nowhere to be seen. I closed up my son's room and went on a bear hunt in the rest of the house. I checked every square inch of the house and I didn't see anything. It was like it vanished into thin air. I contemplated texting my wife and telling her, but I didn't want to freak her out. I was doing enough freaking for the two of us. I went back to my bedroom and crashed onto my bed. I wanted to sleep, but I could feel the excitement pulsing through my body. What the hell was going on? Was I losing it? Was the fear of becoming a dad warping my brain? I didn't have a lot of time to think about it though, because out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move on the baby monitor. I grabbed it and looked close, but the figure wasn't in the frame anymore. I opened the camera controls and started moving the camera to the left. It slowly shifted over and my palms started to sweat. I didn't know if I wanted to see someone or not. The camera stopped panning and there wasn't anything in frame, just an empty space where the bear used to be. Then my door squeaked open. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The door swung open and hit the wall, and I heard footsteps running away from my room and back across the house. I glanced at the monitor and saw a figure blur past the camera in my son's room and head out of frame. I hopped off my bed and ran to the room, fueled more by curiosity than cowed by fear. The door was open again. I ran in and stopped immediately. The closet door was open, and I noticed the lid to the crawl space inside was popped open. Someone was under the house. Why didn't I think to look there before? Oh, right, because how the hell would someone get under my house from the outside without me noticing? The hatch outside was screwed shut, and we had all the openings animal-proofed a few months ago. I scanned the room to make sure someone wasn't hiding behind the curtains, or in the pile of stuffed animals. There was nothing. They had to be under the house. I walked out of the room and closed the door behind me. I wedged a kitchen chair under the handle to keep whoever inside. I wanted to go outside and investigate. If someone crawled under my house, I wanted to trap them in and call the police. The night air was cold, and my skin instantly goose pimpled. At least, I told myself it was because of the cold. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and I began to walk around the foundation looking for any entry point. If my neighbors had looked out their window, they would have thought I was crazy. Here I was, a grown man dressed in nothing but boxers and a t-shirt, holding a closet rod, and scanning the sides of his house with a cell phone flashlight. Even I thought it was crazy. I started at the farthest point from my son's room and walked clockwise. Every time I passed an opening to the crawl space, I expected to see eyes staring back at me, but there wasn't anything. As I rounded the house, I started thinking that maybe I was overreacting, but then I saw footprints in the dirt that led around the corner of the house. I gripped my closet rod hard and turned the corner. The footprints were small and left faint impressions, but they were there. I shined my beam in front of me and followed them as they made their way along the side of my house. I came to a stop at the opening of my outdoor crawlspace hatch. The footprints turned to under the house, but the hatch was still screwed shut. It had never been removed. I had to look to see what was going on under the house. There are times when I am just starting to doze off, and my brain flashes back to this moment. It never fails to put me back from the brink of sleep. It's like someone threw a metaphorical bucket of cold water on my face. My heart races, I become restless, and I always check the baby monitor. I slowly kneeled down to get a better view. The beam of light from my camera shone under the house, but only in a narrow column. Off in the distance, I could see the light reflecting off of something. I couldn't make it out, but it was there. I moved my face closer to the mesh wire hatch opening, and screwed up my face in confusion. What the hell was shining under my house? My nose touched the wire, and I readjusted my beam of light for a better look. It looked like there was two things shining now. That's when my phone died. The light disappeared, then, faintly, I heard a music box start playing Ring-around-the-Rosie. Only it wasn't coming from under the house, it was coming from my bedroom. Suddenly, from my left side, a face appeared next to mine on the other side of the mesh. Before my brain could react, the figure whispered, "We all fall down." I didn't think I could still run that fast, or that far. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get the hell away from my house as fast as I could. Again, if my neighbors saw me, they'd assume I was a druggie or something. I stayed away pretty much the rest of the night. The closest I got was my car, which was parked on the street. As soon as the sun came up, I dared to venture into the house. It was still, almost foreign. I walked towards my son's room, still clutching the closet rod. The door was, not surprisingly, opened. I made my way into the room and looked over at the closet. The crawl space lid was back on. Everything else in the room seemed normal, except one thing. All the stuffed animals were gone. I looked all over but never found them. It was like they vanished. I even went back outside the crawl space hatch and looked in. Didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I felt my blood pressure come back down to earth. Whatever the hell happened seemed to be over. I went back into my room, with every intention of sleeping for 1,000 hours. My body and brain were burnt out from the adrenaline. I opened my door and froze. On my bed was a small, open music box. Ring-around-the-Rosie slowly started playing. I grabbed my wallet and went to a hotel. My wife came back the next day and asked if I was feeling any better, because I looked worse than before. Tired was the word she used. But that's because she's unfailingly polite. I said I was okay, but seemed to still be fighting something. When she got home, she went into our son's room and instantly noticed all the missing stuffed animals. She asked what happened to them. I hesitated and then told her what happened to me the night before. She laughed at first, but stopped when I showed her the music box. We tore the place apart looking for those stuffed animals. I mean, we went everywhere. I was in the attic, in the crawl space, which was yikes. All the rooms, the closets, the nooks, the crannies. We didn't find hair one of any of those stuffed animals. They were just gone. That day, we called over a priest to bless the house. He said things were fine, but how the hell would he know? It was a peace of mind thing, and it mostly worked. In the days that followed, nothing too strange happened. I swore I heard footsteps on the camera and had some buzzy feelings, like I was being watched, but nothing weird. My wife loved the music box. It reminded her of the one she had as a kid, so she placed it in my son's room. I thought this was horrific, and was inviting our visitor to stick around, but when nothing happened, my mind was at ease. Months later, my son was born. I was really hesitant to bring him home, but my wife said I was being crazy. He would be with us for the first few months, and nothing would happen. Every once in a while, I would hear footsteps in the house at night, or the music box would randomly appear in our room, or I would hear it going off on the monitor. There was nothing mean-spirited, if you'll forgive the pun, but more reassuring. After a while, you just kind of forget someone else was there. As weird as all that was, the weirdest thing came almost a year later. Late one night, my wife and I heard scurrying underneath the house. This was unlike anything we'd ever heard before, and that's because rats had made their way in. They chewed right through the outdoor metal hatch. I had been underneath my house enough for 5 lifetimes, so we hired an exterminator to come over and rid us of our rats. He was under the house for 10 minutes before he came crawling back out with a quizzical look on his face. You shouldn't store things under the house. What are you talking about? The stuffed animals? There are like 30 or so, including a big bear. The rats are ripping into them. We didn't put anything under the house. Well, someone did. I can show you. Underneath the house, in the corner near my son's room, were all the missing stuffed animals. I knew they weren't there because I went looking for them and there was nothing. We took them all out, and they were dirty and rat infected at this point, and threw them away. I felt guilty doing it, like we were taking something from our visitor. That night, I decided to make things right. I took the music box and I put it out by the outdoor hatch. If we took away the visitor's animals, I wanted to give them back the music box. My wife thought I was nuts and planned on bringing the music box back into the house in the morning. Later that night, I woke up at around 2 in the morning. I assumed my son was making noise and was hoping he'd put himself back to sleep. However, when I looked at the monitor, he was asleep. I still don't know what the hell compelled me to do this, but I decided to move the camera to the right, towards the closet. The screen slowly shifted until I saw, on the floor outside the closet, the music box. I watched as it opened and started playing. Just then, from behind me, I heard someone whisper, "Thank you." I nearly jumped out of my bed from fright. When I looked back at the camera, the music box was gone. I've worked at my current retail job for over a year now. Retail definitely isn't the most exciting or fulfilling job, but as a full-time student, 20 to 25-hour weeks and a minimum wage aren't the worst either. Our store is located in a mall at the center of town. We sell a variety of goods and, as a result, interact with a variety of customers. We've definitely gotten a few questionable characters. drugged up misfits, or lonely ladies who just want to hold 20-minute long conversations. Anyway, the worst thing about retail isn't the customers. Something strange has been happening. I almost forgot about the first incident. I thought nothing of it until recently. We use walkies and earpieces to communicate with each other. The walkies are automatically set to channel 1, which is what we're all supposed to be on. We've only had one interference before, when someone from another store that just opened somehow hopped onto our channel and talked about going to the back room for a shoe size check. Besides that, though the walkies are a little busted, the communication itself has never been an issue. But one day I heard something. Simply, lift. I want to say that the voice was low, somehow incomprehensible, or crackled with static, something spooky that made it obviously wrong, yet it wasn't. It was just average enough, a female voice, that I thought it was one of my coworkers. Nothing characteristic about it. I thought they were talking to me since I was doing a layout challenge. I spoke back. What was that? Lift, the voice repeated. I was confused. Lift what? The fixture isn't high enough. Come. Someone need help with boxes? I asked. I was met with a long silence. Suddenly, anyone else just hear that? That was definitely my manager's voice. Several other coworkers spoke into the walkie, saying that they also heard the same thing I did. We were all confused, and no one admitted to weirding out everyone else on the walkie. But we also found it funny, and thought someone from another store must have gotten to our channel by accident again. We made guesses about which store it might be from, but quickly brushed it off. That was almost a month ago, and nothing happened after that until yesterday. We had a huge shipment come in the other night, and I had to do a garbage run in the morning. The corridors behind the stores led to other meeting rooms, mall management, offices, daycare centers, and maintenance crew rooms. We have to travel down those hallways and use the freight elevator tucked at the back to descend to the mall's garbage disposal. You can also enter through the mall, but employees and delivery crews aren't allowed to pull shipment or garbage through the mall during open hours. If you've never used a freight elevator, there are basically two doors on either side. The first one on the outside meets in the middle and has to be manually pried open, and then you have to lift the gates up behind it to enter. Then you have to close the exterior doors, and then the gates again before the elevator moves, vice versa when exiting. There's a small window that lets you see through the gated door into and out of the elevator. The hallways in the elevator itself are creepy enough, with dim, low lights, and nonsensical scrawling on the interior walls of the elevator. I've done garbage runs dozens of times though, and nothing weird has ever happened. I unloaded my garbage off the trolley, and went back to the elevator just fine. Going back up to the mall though, the elevator stopped mid-ascent. I was thinking, what the hell? Before the elevator groaned and started moving again. Our elevator, as old as it is, has never stopped mid-descent or ascent before. I emphasize that our walkie communications and these garbage runs have wholly been uneventful because, well, it's weird that this stuff is happening a year into my job. When the elevator stopped, I was just about to lift the gate when I caught something in the corner of my eye. My blood ran cold. There was someone peering in the window from the other side. The face was pale, pushed up and plastered on the window, which fogged up from the breathing. With the way they stuck their face at the window, I could only see half their face, gaping mouth and an unblinking eye staring at me. It was gone in a second before I had a good look. Unnerved, I hesitated opening the doors. I wasn't about to be trapped in the elevator though, and I had a second garbage run to do with the amount of cardboard and garbage we got from shipment. I also thought it might have been a maintenance crew member waiting on the other side. Slowly, I opened up the gates and the exterior doors, careful to train my grip on the door and close it shut if someone were on the other side. There was no one and nothing in the hallways. I peeked around the corner, and the other doors were closed. Two people in one of the offices were chatting. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I closed up the elevator and went back into the store to load the rest of the garbage, and then wheeled back out again with the trolley. It was eerie, but I thought it must have been my imagination because it was gone so quickly. Again, going down and unloading the garbage at the dock was fine, other than the rancid smells and stores that don't know how to recycle. I chalked it up to lack of sleep and the influence of the environment playing mind tricks. This time, before I entered the elevator to go back up, I paused. It was at the window again. inside the elevator. I could see its entire face now. It smiled at me with a wide-toothed grin, impossibly pale and gaunt. I couldn't tell whether or not it was human. It had eyes, a nose, and a mouth. But it just all looked wrong, as if someone took specific features from different people and then threw it all together to create something. It lifted its finger, reached through a hole in the gate, and rapped on the window. Tap, tap, tap. Its grin growing. Unlike before, it didn't go away, just kept tapping. I couldn't see the rest of it and wasn't going to stick around to find out. I ditched the trolley and ran back into the mall the long way, exiting the corridors from downstairs and taking the mall escalator back up to the store. I didn't even look behind me. I knew I didn't imagine it. It looked at me. It invited me in. You bet I told everyone once I got back. My coworkers and manager were freaked out at first, but didn't really believe me and thought I was trying to scare them. Or perhaps mistook a mall employee for something else. There has to be a logical explanation, they kept saying. My face was pale. My hands were shaking. I didn't even have the trolley with me, and I couldn't believe my coworkers still thought I was joking or imagining things. But I dragged another coworker with me today to get the trolley back. I needed someone else to believe me. We didn't use the elevator, obviously, but entered through the downstairs mall corridors at my insistence. I glanced at the window. There was nothing there. I don't personally know anyone else who works in the mall, so I've just been walking into stores and asking employees from stores who use the same corridors we do. I've spoken with people from 3 stores so far. 2 stores share similar experiences. Apparently, one of the stores also gets the walkie interferences, however much more frequently. The girl I was talking to described the voice as monotone, sounding like it's being altered and masked by a machine, like individuals' voices in shows, where they maintain anonymity. It hasn't gotten too serious for them yet, and hasn't said anything threatening, so they've dubbed this voice as the lonely mall ghost, or a bored teenager, and laugh about it. What the hell? They haven't seen it yet. The second store, they've interacted with it. They say it's because I spoke to it. I'm fairly sure my cat saved my life last night. Believe me, I feel ridiculous making that assertion. Cats aren't exactly known for heroically defending their owners, but I will swear on anything you like. I now owe my continued existence to my 13-pound furry gremlin. I just have the one cat, Bugsy, a rage-fueled 4-year-old ginger tabby. Her average day consists of sleeping, biting my feet, and pooping in my bathroom sink. Not exactly the hero songs are made of, but I love her despite myself. After all, she's the only pet I've ever had, and I would slay legions for her. I go to bed around 11, and she generally runs up and down the hallway for about 30 minutes before coming and curling up next to me. Sometimes I swear she is trying to smother me, by wallowing all over my face and sticking her whiskers up my nose, so I didn't find it remotely strange to feel 4 little paws hop onto my bed and walk across my chest. I could hear her purring, and she circled on top of me. Eyes closed, I reached a hand out to pet her. My fingers were met with a disconcerting texture, akin to the rough side of a kitchen sponge. Pulling my hand away, I could feel the purring rattling through my bones. My eyes flew open. Even in the dark, I could tell it wasn't Bugsy on my chest. The rough fur that covered this animal was blacker than the darkness surrounding it. It stood on long, slender legs that supported a skin and bones body. Its head was teardrop-shaped, with no visible nose, and eyes that were much too big. Massive, reflective orange eyes met mine. The purr deepened, a thumping bass radiating through my body. I stared, transfixed, into those luminous eyes. It blinked slowly, languidly. I realized that I wasn't breathing and drew in a long, shuddering breath. It smiled. Hundreds of tiny teeth glowed in the scant light as the creature smiled, opening its mouth much further than it should have been able to. Hot air smelling of tar and smoke forced its way down to my lungs. The purr changed, gradually becoming higher pitched, until it sounded more like the whine of an airplane engine. I felt my eardrums pop agonizingly. I couldn't think, couldn't move. The all-consuming need was to keep staring into those eyes. Galaxies and nebula spun behind those eyes. The inky depths of the ocean could be found in those eyes. Hot liquid was dripping out of my ears. Then As quickly as they appeared, the eyes were gone. The weight was ripped from my chest, and the purring stopped abruptly as the animal flew, shrieking against the wall. I saw a flash of orange as Bugsy tackled the thing. My hands flew up to cover my ears as the shrieking continued, joined by the hissing, spitting ferocity of Bugsy. Bugsy flew back across the bed with a loud pop. Finally coming to my senses, I jumped out of bed and flicked the light switch. Bugsy paced back and forth, tail twitching, agitated. Panically, my eyes darted all over the room. The thing was nowhere in sight. I dropped to the floor and looked under the bed. Nothing. Bugsy licked at a scratch on her shoulder. I cautiously crawled across the bed to the far corner where the thing had last been. The only sign I could find of the creature was a vicious green liquid on one of my pillows. Shaking, I pulled Bugsy to me, looking her over. Aside from a couple of scratches on her, she was fine. I hugged her tight as she glared at me. I haven't seen any indication of it coming back yet, but I can't bring myself to turn the light off or to let Bugsy leave my sight. I took her to the vet today to make sure nothing more was wrong. I had to tell him that she had gotten in a fight with another cat, but I didn't have a good explanation when he pulled a straight, black claw out of one of the cuts. Maybe this doesn't belong here, but I have to say something. The other night I got a call while at work. I work at a group home where I take care of the elderly. I absolutely love my job. But I digress. 5 minutes before my coworker is supposed to come in to relieve me, I work alone. She calls me and long story short, she can't get there yet. No worries, I'm pretty easygoing. So I wait. I'm watching Attack on Titan on my phone, so I am certainly not mad. An hour after I'm supposed to get off work, 11 p.m., she calls me again. She still can't come in. I offer to take her shift for her, so she didn't have to worry. She was crying on the phone. She asks if I'm sure, and I say yeah, no worries, I got it. She thanks me profusely and apologizes. I tell her it's fine. We get off the phone and I go back to watching AOT. Midnight rolls around. I hear something. It's faint. To say the place I work at is in the middle of nowhere would be an understatement. On one side of me I have woods, and on the other side there's a cornfield. I'm not quite sure what I'm hearing, but I dismiss it as a coyote. Coyotes are kind of a problem out here. But then it gets louder. I can hear it a little better, and it most certainly is not a coyote. It kind of sounds like chanting, but it's very faint. I pause my show and take a look outside in the darkness. There's nothing. I go and check on the people I take care of. I go room to room. No one's TV is on, and everyone is asleep. I think I'm going crazy. Or maybe it's something I'm hearing in the background of my show. I go and sit back down and just listen for a while. I don't hear anything. I chuckle a little bit because I figure I'm just freaking myself out. I put my one headphone back in my ear and start again with AOT. Not even 10 minutes later the chanting starts again, and this time it sounds like it's coming from the porch. I rush to the sliding glass door and lock it. I turn on the porch light. I would be lying if I said I knew exactly what it was I saw. It looked kind of like people, scurrying into the darkness. I grabbed a knife out of the kitchen drawer. I went again, room to room, as quietly as I could so as to not disturb the residents. I checked under the beds, in the closets, in the bathrooms, and I made sure that everything was locked. I turned on every light I could. I looked back out of the sliding door and didn't see anything. The porch light isn't bright enough to shine light on the cornfield, because it's on that side of the house. But I don't see anything, no movement or anything. I sit back down in my chair, still clutching my knife. I sit and listen intently. About an hour goes by, and everything is still silent. The adrenaline had long worn off, and I was starting to get really tired. I went and made a cup of coffee, and sat back down and drank it. I put my headphone back in, and put AOT back on so I can stay awake. Morning shift comes in several hours later. I give my report, but I don't mention all of the craziness that happened. At that point, I just wanted to go home. I get home, crawl in bed, and eventually fall asleep. When I wake up, I see that I have a missed call and a voicemail from my boss. I listened to the voicemail and called my boss back. The elderly woman that I take care of passed in her sleep. She was found by the morning shift in her bed. The woman who called in last night quit. To be fair, her and the elderly woman were actually pretty close. but now my boss wants me to work the overnight again tonight, and I am so terrified that I can't stop crying. He doesn't have anyone else to go in, and he himself is currently out of state on one last camping trip of the year. I'm so scared, and I have no idea what to do. I've always thought of myself as a good person. The blood-stained brick, which is currently sitting in the back of my closet, would suggest otherwise, though. I was stumbling home after a night of drinking alone when it started, making my way down a graffiti-smeared alley. I tripped over a crack in the pavement. I placed my hand over a three-eyed, psychedelic cat, which was spray-painted on a nearby wall. With the world swirling around me, I tried to talk myself out of throwing up. Suddenly, I heard a woman's voice behind me say, "Hey, handsome." Shocked, I whirled around. I was met with nothing but a wall, so I cautiously peered down the alley in both directions. Even though my vision was blurry and it was getting dark, I was sure that nobody was around. I slapped myself on the cheeks and rubbed my eyes, murmuring, "I have to stop drinking." Where's the fun in that?" the same voice exclaimed. Now I was scared. The voice seemed to be coming from directly in front of me. I squinted and moved closer to the wall opposite me. In the dim light, I could see that somebody had painted a portrait of a woman onto the bricks. She was beautiful, with pale skin, blonde hair, bright green eyes, and a lollipop stick clenched between her teeth. I stepped towards the picture and ran my hand tenderly along her cheek, entranced. The voice let out a little giggle when I did this, and I stumbled back. "Hey now, surely you're not the type to put on the moves with a girl before you even learn her name." My mouth flapped open in shock. Somehow, impossibly, there was a voice coming from the wall. The picture of the girl didn't move, but there was no doubt in my mind that it was somehow speaking to me. What's your name?" I stammered. "I can't tell you that. Sorry, sweetie." She responded coyly. The next few hours went by in a blur while we spoke. I spent most of the time telling her about myself, lamenting over how unfairly life had been treating me lately. My girlfriend had just dumped me for another guy, and all of my old friends seemed to be moving on with their lives. She listened intently the whole time, sporadically asking probing questions. Trust me, in hindsight, I know how pathetic this sounds. In the moment there was something about the picture which drew me in. I want to think that she somehow enchanted me supernaturally, but maybe I'm just saying that to ease the guilt. In the early hours of the morning, I heard someone approaching us. I quickly stopped talking and tried to look like I was leaning against the wall casually. It was pitch black now, so I could barely see him, but from the smell, I could tell he was drunk. When he was a little way past us, the girl whispered, "Disgusting. What a pathetic loser. I bet he was out drinking alone. What a waste of life." I was shocked. So far, she had been nothing but sweet. I didn't understand where this aggression was coming from. The worst part, though, was that it felt like she was describing me. "You should pick up that brick behind you and bash his brains in, honey. You'd be doing the world a favor." I took a step back and turned to look over my shoulder. Sure enough, there was a brick sitting against the wall, near where I had initially stopped to steady myself. Suddenly, my heart rate started to pick up and I clenched my fist. An unfamiliar, foreign feeling of rage began to build up inside me. I agreed with her. He was human filth and a blight on society. Nothing like me. Quietly, I picked up the brick. Creeping up behind him, I felt certain that I was doing the right thing. The fury continued to swell, and it came to a peak when I raised the brick and brought it down on his head. He fell, sprawling to the ground in front of me, jabbering something incomprehensible. I struck him over and over again, glad to put him out of his misery. After it was over, I walked back to her. "Great job, pretty boy. Now I just need you to do something for me. Bring his body over here for me, would you?" I nodded. The rage was gone and now I just felt numb. I went over and dragged his body along the alley, dropping him in front of her. "Beautiful. Now, just do one last thing for me, would you? Take some of the blood from that hole you made in his head and rub it all over me." I pushed my hand into the gash of the back of his head and smeared his blood on the bricks. The picture began to change. First, the rest of her body appeared, painted on the wall. Suddenly exhausted, I sat on the ground and just watched. Gradually, she began to emerge from the wall. First it was her face, then her body, and finally her arms and legs. When she was out of the wall, she stood, looking over me while I remained on the floor. Somehow, she was more beautiful in person than she was on the wall. She captivated me with those stunning eyes. Then she smiled. She took the lollipop stick out of her mouth and handed it to me. Then she winked and said, "Thanks, hun," before walking off into the night. Growing up, I've always been into the paranormal. My family is too. My dad would always watch creepy shows with me like Celebrity Ghost Story and Creepy Canada. My grandmother would tell me of her encounters with Ouija boards and other kinds of encounters she had throughout her life. I was taught to never allow a spirit into my life, but I soon learned that my obsession with the paranormal was basically an invitation for all things unearthly. When I was about 10 years old, I used a Ouija board with my friends. Although my family warned me and advised me not to use it, my obsession with the unknown got the best of me. This experience is a story for another time, but I believe that because my friends and I did not play by the rules and never said goodbye, it has left a portal open to me for the rest of my life for spirits to come and go as they please. The story I will be telling you today is about the second house I grew up in. When I was 12, my mom got a better job and we moved from our sketchy neighborhood to a very well-off area with decently new housing. I was not happy about the move. I missed my friends in my area where I could get anywhere I needed within a 10-minute walk. I was not happy about starting school with kids I saw as spoiled and preppy. I spent most of my days indoors, as it was summer when we moved, and I had no new friends. I refused to befriend the girl next door who was my age. When we first moved here, I refused to sleep with the door closed or the lights out. I spent most of my nights tossing and turning, and the sleep I did get was filled with nightmares. I remember seeing slight flashes in my head of a woman that looked a lot like the scary woman from Insidious with the veil in my closet. Years went by, and soon enough I was 18 still living in the same house. The flashes had stopped for the most part, or visions or whatever you want to call them. The house still gave me the creeps though, and nightmares were still frequent. I still refused to sleep in the dark because when I did, I would hear whispers in my ear. I would hear someone say my name, a woman whispering for me to wake up. One summer night, I was tucked into bed and decided again to give sleeping in the dark another try. I turned off my bedside lamp and began to fall asleep. I was in that stage where you're just about to pass out when I heard in my ear a woman whisper urgently, "Rachel." I jolted out of my sleep to look around and found nothing in my room. I began to doze off again when I hear, "Rachel, wake up." I jolt up again to find nothing in my room. I dumbly shrug it off and go back to bed. The next night I am once again sleeping in the dark. I must note that I am quite the heavy sleeper. Storms do not wake me when I am asleep. Pretty much only alarms. But for some reason this night I woke up to a ruffling sound coming from the end of my bed. When I woke up, I just lay there with my eyes closed, wondering why in the hell that woke me up and what that noise could be. It was a quiet ruffling, almost like a plastic bag. I finally sat up and looked to the end of the bed. There in the dark, I could make out the figure of a woman. I could see the outline of the breast in the shadow, and the slender and tall body. My eyes adjusted and I blinked like crazy, but this figure did not go away. As hard as I tried, I could not see the face of the woman. I called out to her, assuming she was my mom because sometimes my mom would come in my room to check on me. "Mom, what are you doing?" There was no reply, just silence. I sat up more and looked out. I found it strange that she would be standing at the end of my bed though. After a while of repeating and yelling, "Who are you?" and "Hello? Who is it?" I realized this was not my mom. I assumed it was an intruder and panicked. I turned quickly to the bedside table where my lamp was. I turned it on and whipped my head to see who was in the room, and when I looked, there was nobody there. My mom came running in my room asking what was wrong. "Someone was in here," I cried. She checked the locks, and to my surprise nobody was in the house, and all the doors remained locked as they had been the whole night. After that, I checked my phone and it was around 3:15 a.m. Somehow my boyfriend at the time had woken up as well, and had the urge to call me at that moment. I sat up for the rest of the night terrified that whatever that thing was would come back. This has never happened again. I have not seen a figure or heard anything since in my home, but I have many other stories of the past. and encounters friends and family have had in my house. To this day, I struggle to sleep in the dark. I just wonder what that woman was. We were all there when Joey lost his mind. He was just sitting in his cubicle, chatting with Rebecca. The whole company had a pool going on when they would finally admit they were dating. I had $50 on it being before the day was over. So I was starting to sweat. He leaned over, noticed me staring at him, and winked one gorgeous blue eye at me. My heart fluttered. Then he screamed. Everybody jumped. Joey kept right on screaming as he toppled off his chair and fell to the floor. His screaming was unintelligible, unfocused gibberish. He got on all fours and started crawling on the floor. He looked up at me and finally got some lucid words out of his mouth. "Help me. I don't know where I am." Two of the burlier guys from the office grabbed him by the arms and put him in a chair. Rebecca was calling an ambulance. It didn't take a genius to tell he was having some kind of nervous breakdown. A group was crowding around him, disregarding someone's call that they gave him some air. I joined them. "What's wrong, Joey?" Someone shouted. "What's gotten into you?" He just wildly stared at all of us, seemingly not recognizing anyone. "Who are you people? Where am I?" "Relax, Joey," I said. "You're with friends. What's the last thing you remember?" The question seemed to knock him out of his daze. He was staring at his hands like he couldn't recognize them, like they were someone else's. I think I was in Mr. Ryberg's class, and his class was so boring and I was so tired, but I couldn't go to sleep because I was scared, but I did. His face went slack, like he had remembered something important. "When is it? What day? What month? When is it?" "Relax," I said soothingly. "The paramedics will be here in... When is it?" I flinched. Joey was screaming like a mad beast. "September 10th, 2019, Joey. You've worked here for 4 years. His face went white. He began to mumble. "No. How did it get so strong? What happened?" Tears began to stream down his cheeks. I followed them up to his eyes. They were brown. Dark brown. I was gently pushed aside by the paramedics. Rebecca had fainted, so I volunteered to accompany Joey to the hospital. As he was pushed, he kept raving like a man possessed. Something was decidedly off about him, apart from all the kicking and screaming. He kept on mumbling as they took him into the elevator. "I can't sleep. He's coming. He's in the dark places." He suddenly grabbed at my arm. "Don't let them put me to sleep. Please, It comes from me when I sleep, but it doesn't let go." He put my hand on his head. "It's still here. It never leaves." I looked into his eyes, his deep, unnatural brown eyes. They were wet with tears. "Don't let it take me." We arrived at the ambulance. He was thrashing again, so they strapped him into the gurney. One of the paramedics pulled out a needle, a sedative. I rushed out and said, Sir, Joey was really insistent that he not be put to sleep." The paramedic gave out the long, suffering sigh of a man who's constantly told how to do his job. "Lady, this man is a danger to himself and others. Procedures call for us to knock him out." But the paramedic just sighed and stuck it in him anyway. "If you're going to be trouble, we're going to need someone else for the companion." I stopped talking. Joey kicked for a few moments longer, then passed out peacefully with a smile on his face. He woke up a few hours later in the hospital. He looked at me and grinned in that way I'd always found so beguiling. "Thanks for bringing me here, Sarah," he said. "I hope I didn't say anything too crazy on the way here." I didn't answer. I just stared at him. His eyes were blue, bright blue.